A flow variable is a parameter available in a KNIME workflow to overwrite configuration settings of nodes. But why do we need them? Let's take a look at some examples. In this workflow, we read in some data with sales records. Next, we isolate the sales records for Germany with this row filter node. We then calculate the sum of sales with the group by node, and finally, we rename the column that shows the sum of sales to Germany. This workflow works fine for the country of Germany. But if we want to obtain the same table for the USA, we need to change the configuration of both the row filter and the column rename node, which would be tedious. And just think, this is a relatively simple workflow. If we had a much more complex workflow with many more nodes and many more settings to define, it would be highly impractical to manually change the settings. This is exactly where we need a flow variable to parameterize a workflow. In our case here, we need a flow variable to execute the workflow for different countries. So, let's create it. There are two ways of creating a flow variable for a KNIME workflow: exporting a configuration setting and using a configuration node. Let's first have a look at how we can export a node's configuration as a flow variable. Now that we've defined the filtering pattern Germany once in this row filter node, we might want to reuse the configuration. We can export this setting in the Flow Variables tab by writing the name of the flow variable in this empty field next to pattern. If we open the output of the node, we find this flow variable in the Flow Variables tab, and it can be used by the subsequent nodes in the workflow. Let's check next how to create a flow variable using a configuration node. You can find the configuration nodes if you navigate to Workflow Abstraction, Configuration in the node repository. As an easy example, let's look at the string configuration node. This node creates a flow variable of type string. The red circle at the node output indicates a flow variable. In the configuration dialog, we set the name of the flow variable to country and the default value to Germany. We've shown two ways of creating a flow variable here. When we want to create a workflow variable based on an existing value without requiring user input, we can do so within the Flow Variables tab of a node, as we showed previously. When we want to make sure a user is prompted to provide a value for a workflow variable, we can use a configuration node instead. Now, to use this flow variable, we'll have to connect it to the workflow. Let's connect the output of the string configuration node to the input of the row filter node. But where exactly? Flow variable input and output ports are hidden by default. But if we right-click the node and select Show Flow Variable Ports, they appear on top of the node. We can now connect the flow variable ports of these two nodes. Actually, the flow variable port appears automatically if we drag a flow variable connection and drop it on the place where the port is hidden. Now, let's use this flow variable to overwrite some configuration settings. We open the configuration dialog of the row filter node where we want to overwrite the string pattern for filtering. In this case, there's a flow variable button next to the setting. This button allows us to overwrite this particular setting with a flow variable. We can find this button here because this setting is often overwritten by a flow variable. We click the button, and in the dialog that opens, we select Use Variable and select the flow variable country that we want to use for filtering. Notice that you could also export the current setting as a flow variable via this button by selecting Create Variable and writing the name of the flow variable here in this field. Let's also override a setting for the column rename node. You'll notice that this time, however, there's no flow variable button next to the setting that we want to overwrite, namely the new name of the column. To set it, we open the Flow Variables tab and search for this setting there. In the menu next to the new column name setting, we select the flow variable that we want to use as the new column name. In this case, the country flow variable. Now, let's execute the workflow. If we open the output of the row filter node, we can see that it only contains records for Germany. The column rename node has renamed the column to Germany. Let's check next what happens if we change the value of the flow variable to USA. We reconfigure the string configuration node, change the default value to USA, and execute the workflow again. Now, the workflow has filtered the data to the corresponding records and renamed the column to USA. In this video, we've explained how to use flow variables as parameters to overwrite node settings. We've shown how to create a flow variable by either exporting them from the Flow Variables tab or using a configuration node. Flow variables are only visible to the downstream nodes in the workflow, and you can find them in the Flow Variables tab of the node's output. All nodes have hidden flow variable ports to access and export flow variables.